The desert floor cracks under a heat so absolute it distorts the horizon into liquid. No road, no trail, no landmark a European eye could identify. Just sand, scrub, volcanic rock, and the kind of silence that swallows men whole. And somewhere out there, moving through it at a pace that seemed physically impossible, were Apache scouts, men who had mastered terrain that killed outsiders within days, who read the land the way a scholar reads a printed page, and who carried in their bodies an entire geographic intelligence that no map of the era could replicate. This is not a story about warriors in the romantic Hollywood sense of the word. This is a story about a specific, devastating, almost supernatural form of human capability, the ability to move unseen, unerringly, across hundreds of miles of hostile, waterless, unforgiving territory, in conditions that broke the finest military units the United States Army had ever assembled. Understanding how Apache scouts traveled requires dismantling almost every assumption a modern person brings to the idea of movement through wilderness. We tend to imagine survival in the desert as a matter of endurance, of pushing through pain and dehydration until you reach safety. The Apache conception was entirely different. Survival was not about endurance. It was about intelligence. It was about reading the world so precisely that the desert itself became an ally rather than an adversary. The Apache peoples, and it is important to understand that Apache is a collective term encompassing distinct groups including the Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, White Mountain, and several others, each with their own territorial knowledge and tactical traditions, had been refining this intelligence for generations before the Spanish arrived in the southwest. Their adaptation to the Sonoran Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, and the mountain ranges and river systems threading between them was not merely cultural, it was physiological, psychological, and epistemological. They perceived the environment through categories of observation that had no equivalent in European experience, and they acted on that perception with a speed and precision that seemed, to outside observers, almost miraculous. The U.S. Army officers who worked alongside Apache scouts in the campaigns of the 1870s and 1880s consistently described a kind of bewilderment, a sense that the men beside them were operating on entirely different sensory and cognitive terms. General George Crook, arguably the officer who understood Apache capabilities better than any other American commander of the period, was direct about it. He stated plainly that without Apache scouts, the campaigns against Geronimo and the hostile Chiricahua bands would have been entirely unwinnable. And Crook was not a man given to flattery or exaggeration. To understand why, you need to understand what the landscape actually demanded. The territory across which Apache scouts operated in the campaign years encompassed some of the most punishing geography on the continent. The Sierra Madre Range in northern Mexico, a place of plunging canyons, dense pine forest at elevation, and near vertical rock faces, formed one operational theater. The lowland deserts stretching from the Mexican border northward through Arizona and New Mexico formed another. Between them lay a transition zone of broken mesa country, dry washes, alkali flats, and mountain ranges rising abruptly from the desert floor. Summer temperatures in the lowlands regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter nights in the high country fell well below freezing. Water sources were separated by distances that, under desert conditions, could mean the difference between life and death by a margin of hours. And crossing all of this, the Apache scouts moved at speeds and distances that Army infantry couldn't match, in conditions Army cavalry found barely survivable. The foundation of Apache movement was water knowledge, not general knowledge. Precise, specific, verified knowledge of every reliable spring, seep, tinaja, and seasonal water source across territories spanning hundreds of miles. A tinaja is a natural rock basin, typically carved by centuries of water erosion, that collects and holds rainwater long after a storm. In country where no obvious watercourse exists, tanajas can sustain life, but only if you know exactly where they are, how much they are likely to hold at a given time of year, and whether they are currently accessible or have been fouled or emptied. Apache scouts carried this knowledge as a kind of mental infrastructure. A young man training under experienced warriors learned water sources the way a student learns multiplication tables. Through repetition, through direct experience, through the transmission of accumulated community knowledge that represented centuries of careful observation. The specific location of a hidden spring 20 miles into a dry mountain range was not something you discovered under pressure. It was something you knew before you needed it, known so completely that it required no conscious effort to recall. This water geography shaped everything about how Apache scouts planned and executed movement. A route through hostile territory was not chosen primarily for speed or directness. It was chosen along a string of known water sources, spaced at intervals a human body could sustain. The scouts understood precisely how far a person could travel in a given temperature range, on a given water intake, and they planned accordingly. This sounds clinical in description, but the practical execution was breathtaking. Army columns that attempted to follow Apache routes across the same terrain routinely found themselves in water crisis within days, even when following the same general direction the scouts had traveled days before. The difference was not the route itself. It was the granular, verified knowledge of every viable water source along it, and the tactical judgment about which sources to use, in which sequence, at which time of day. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Whether you're out in the American Southwest yourself or watching from somewhere completely different, we want to know. This history belongs to all of us. Time of movement was equally critical, and the Apache approach to it was essentially the inverse of what most people intuitively understand about desert travel. Movement during peak daytime heat was avoided not merely as a comfort measure, but as a strict operational calculation. The human body loses water at a rate that is dramatically accelerated by exertion in high heat. An Apache scout moving in the early morning hours, before the sun had fully risen and the rock began radiating stored heat, consumed a fraction of the water that the same movement would have cost at noon. Evening and nighttime movement offered similar advantages, and the Apache were, by all historical accounts, extraordinarily capable of navigating complex terrain in darkness. This was not a matter of exceptional night vision in the biological sense. It was the product of a landscape so deeply memorized that darkness removed only visual confirmation of what was already known. A scout, moving through familiar territory at night, was not groping through darkness. He was moving through a detailed internal map, confirming his position through touch, smell, sound, and the felt geometry of the land beneath his feet. The memorization of terrain extended far beyond water sources. Apache scouts internalized the topography of their operational areas in 3 dimensions, not as flat map knowledge, but as a felt, embodied understanding of gradient, exposure, sightlines, and acoustic properties. They knew which ridgelines offered observation without silhouette exposure, which canyon walls produced echoes that could betray movement, which dry washes channeled wind in ways that carried sound over unexpected distances. This acoustic awareness was particularly sophisticated. The desert, contrary to its popular image as a silent place, is full of sound. The calls of birds, whose behavior changes when humans are present, the particular quality of silence that falls when a predator is near, the distant percussion of hooves on hard ground that carries for miles under the right atmospheric conditions. Apache scouts read these sounds with the same interpretive precision they applied to visual signs, and their ability to detect the presence and movement of both human and animal life through sound alone was a consistent source of amazement among American military observers. Tracking was perhaps the most technically sophisticated element of Apache scout capability, and it is also the element most commonly reduced to mythology in popular culture. The popular image of a tracker crouching over a single footprint and divining elaborate narratives from it misses the actual cognitive process entirely. Real tracking at the level Apache scouts practiced, it was a probabilistic reasoning system applied across large areas of terrain, integrating dozens of simultaneously observed data points into a continuously updated picture of where specific individuals or groups had gone, when, at what pace, under what conditions, and, crucially, where they were likely heading. A single footprint tells you relatively little. The relationship between dozens of prints, observed in sequence across varying terrain types, tells you whether the person was walking or running, whether they were carrying weight, whether they were fatigued, whether they were trying to conceal their movement, and whether they had passed recently or hours ago. The freshness of a track is determined not simply by visual crispness, but by the behavior of the surrounding vegetation, whether bent grass has begun to spring back, whether disturbed soil has begun to dry at its edges, whether moisture in a footprint has evaporated to a degree consistent with a specific elapsed time at a specific temperature. Apache scouts could follow a trail that was, to untrained eyes, invisible. They could distinguish between the passage of a single individual and the passage of a group in ways that revealed approximate size, composition, and urgency of movement. They could track across rock, where no conventional footprint is left, by reading the microscopic traces of foot passage, the faint displacement of lichen, the infinitesimal scratches left by hard-soled moccasins on specific rock types, the pattern of disturbed pebbles at a crossing point. And they could do all of this while moving at a pace that kept them tactically relevant. Tracking was not a slow, painstaking activity conducted in isolation. It was a continuous background process integrated into normal movement, something the best practitioners could maintain almost unconsciously while simultaneously monitoring their environment for other threats and information. The moccasin itself was a piece of tactical equipment as much as footwear, and its design reflected specific operational requirements. Apache moccasins were constructed with rawhide soles that were both durable enough to traverse rocky terrain and sensitive enough to transmit ground texture to the wearer's foot. The sensation of the ground beneath the foot was informational. A skilled scout could feel the difference between solid substrate and hollow ground, could detect the subtle vibration of distant movement transmitted through rock, could identify terrain types in darkness by feel alone. The high-top design, common among some Apache groups, offered ankle protection in thorny desert scrub and some degree of resistance to snake strike, while remaining flexible enough for the rapid directional changes that broken terrain demanded. These were not decorative items. They were precision instruments, and a scout's relationship to his footwear was as technically considered as an artisan's relationship to specialized tools. Camouflage and concealment in Apache practice operated on principles that were more behavioral than material. The use of plant material, earth, and other natural elements to obscure human silhouette and break up the human outline was certainly practiced, but the more fundamental concealment principle was behavioral, moving in ways that did not disturb the natural patterns of the environment. Animals in a landscape behave in specific ways in the absence of threat. Their movements, their sounds, their attention, all of these constitute a kind of ambient information field that any alert observer can read for signs of human presence. Apache scouts understood that their passage through a landscape would be visible to this animal intelligence long before it became visible to any human pursuer, and they modulated their movement accordingly, moving with the wind rather than against it, timing movement to coincide with periods of natural animal activity that would mask human sound signatures, avoiding the specific behaviors, abrupt movement, inconsistent rhythm, unnatural stillness, that trigger alarm responses in prey animals were all standard operational considerations. This behavioral camouflage extended to the management of fire, which in desert country is visible from extraordinary distances at night and detectable by smell over many miles under certain wind conditions. Apache encampments in hostile territory used fire minimally or not at all, accepting the hardship of cold camps as a worthwhile tactical trade for concealment. When fire was necessary, for warmth in mountain elevations where freezing temperatures were genuinely life-threatening, the specific selection of fuel, the management of flame height, and the positioning of the fire relative to terrain features that would obscure or dissipate its light were all carefully considered. Small fires of specifically chosen dry wood, positioned in depressions or behind rock formations, produced minimal smoke and could be extinguished rapidly. These were not improvisational decisions made under pressure. They were the products of deeply internalized doctrine, practices transmitted through training and cultural education that represented accumulated tactical wisdom. Where are you watching this from right now? If you're finding this content valuable, share it with someone who loves American history. This is the kind of story that deserves a wider audience. The communication systems Apache Scouts used during movement deserve specific attention because they are frequently described in historical accounts with a kind of mystified awe that, on examination, resolves into something even more impressive than the mystery suggests. Smoke signals are the element most commonly mentioned in popular culture, and they were indeed used, but as a relatively coarse, long-distance system for broad, categorical communication rather than detailed message transmission. Far more sophisticated was the system of ground signs, deliberate arrangements of rocks, sticks, grass, and other natural materials left at specific locations to convey precise information to following parties. A correctly placed arrangement of stones at a trail junction could communicate direction of travel, approximate number of individuals, time of passage, and whether the passage was casual or urgent, all to a reader who knew the code. These signs were designed to be legible to knowledgeable Apache readers while appearing to uninitiated eyes as random natural debris. Their effectiveness as a covert communication medium depended on the invisibility of their constructed nature to those who didn't know what they were looking at. Mirror signaling using polished metal or obsidian was another communication method that combined long range with high security in specific conditions. A mirror flash is visible over extraordinary distances, up to 20 miles, under good atmospheric conditions, but is nearly impossible to decode without knowing the specific signal code being used, and its source is difficult to locate precisely for an observer who doesn't know where to look. Apache Scouts using mirror signals could coordinate across mountain ranges in ways that were effectively invisible to Army units operating in the same territory, transmitting information about troop movements, water conditions, and tactical situations in real time. The Army's own adoption of mirror signaling, eventually formalized in the heliostat system, was directly inspired by observing Apache practice in the field. Physical conditioning among Apache Scouts was extraordinary by the standards of any military force of the period, but it was achieved through methods that differed fundamentally from the regimented physical training of European military tradition. Apache youth began their preparation for the demands of scouting not through formal exercise programs, but through a progressive system of increasingly challenging physical tasks integrated into daily life. Long-distance running was the foundational physical practice, and not running in the modern athletic sense of sustained aerobic effort on flat ground, but running across the actual terrain of the Southwest, which meant negotiating rocks, cactus, steep grades, loose scree and sand in conditions of heat and restricted water access. Young men in training were required to run distances that seem implausible to modern readers. Accounts consistently describe training runs of 20 to 30 miles in a single session, but the purpose was not simply cardiovascular development. It was the internalization of the specific physical demands of operational movement, the development of a personal kinesthetic library of how the body performs under specific types of stress, and the cultivation of the pain management and motivational psychology that sustained performance under genuine operational conditions. The requirement to hold water in the mouth during long runs, a training practice mentioned in multiple historical accounts, served a dual purpose. It enforced nasal breathing, which is physiologically more efficient and less dehydrating than mouth breathing during sustained exertion, and it familiarized the trainee with the sensation of carrying water in the mouth as a resource management practice. In conditions of extreme heat and restricted water supply, the ability to hold water in the mouth and meter its use rather than consuming it immediately in response to thirst was a meaningful survival advantage. The body's thirst mechanism in extreme heat conditions can be physiologically misleading. The sensation of intense thirst is not always an accurate indicator of actual hydration status, and a scout who consumed all available water at the first surge of thirst might find himself critically compromised hours later. The discipline to manage water intake strategically rather than impulsively was built through training that made the practice habitual. Altitude was another dimension of physical performance that Apache scouts managed with a sophistication that reflected generations of experience operating across dramatic elevation gradients. The transition from desert floor at roughly 1,000 feet of elevation to Sierra Madre peaks above 8,000 feet involved significant changes in both temperature and atmospheric oxygen density. The physical demands of sustained movement at altitude are substantially different from those at sea level, and unacclimatized individuals who attempt rapid ascent typically experience a meaningful performance degradation that can shade into incapacitation under extreme conditions. Apache scouts, who grew up moving across these elevation gradients, had developed the physiological adaptations: elevated red blood cell count, more efficient oxygen utilization in the muscles that characterized high-altitude populations globally. More importantly, they had developed the tactical knowledge of how to pace movement across elevation transitions in ways that avoided the worst effects of rapid altitude change, and the route knowledge that allowed them to plan ascents and descents at rates the body could manage. Nutrition during extended scout operations was a study in pragmatic ingenuity that drew on extraordinarily detailed knowledge of the desert's edible resources. The desert Southwest is, contrary to popular conception, a landscape of remarkable biological diversity and significant nutritional abundance for those who know how to access it. Apache scouts on extended operations could supplement carried rations with wild plant foods, the seeds of various grasses and forbs, the pads and fruit of prickly pear cactus, mescal hearts roasted in pit fires, wild onions, berries at appropriate elevations and seasons, and with opportunistic hunting that, critically, required no delay of movement. An Apache scout could kill a small animal, consume the most nutritionally valuable portions, and be back in motion within minutes without a fire if conditions demanded it. The consumption of raw organ meat, particularly the liver and kidney of freshly killed game, was both a practical nutritional strategy and a culturally embedded practice. Organ meats are among the most nutritionally dense foods available, and their consumption provided vitamins and minerals that sustained energy and cognitive function under conditions where caloric intake was generally below maintenance requirements. Medicinal plant knowledge was integrated into this nutritional understanding in ways that had direct operational relevance. The ability to identify and use plants with anti-inflammatory, analgesic, or antimicrobial properties meant that scouts could treat injuries and illness without disrupting operations, maintaining combat effectiveness through minor wounds or infections that might have sidelined less self-sufficient practitioners. The specific pharmacological understanding embedded in Apache traditional medicine, developed through centuries of empirical observation and transmitted through apprenticeship, represented a body of practical knowledge about the biochemistry of the local plant ecology that was, in many cases, entirely accurate and effective. Army surgeons who worked alongside Apache scouts during the campaign period recorded instances of wound treatment and illness management that they found genuinely effective, while acknowledging that they didn't fully understand the mechanisms involved. If this video is teaching you something you never learned in school, go ahead and leave a like. It genuinely helps us keep making content like this, and we appreciate every single one of you watching. The psychological dimension of Apache Scout capability was as precisely cultivated as the physical. Extended operations in hostile territory imposed psychological pressures that broke lesser prepared individuals. The sustained vigilance required to move through an environment where any encounter with hostile parties could be fatal. The management of fear in conditions of genuine life-threatening danger, the maintenance of rational decision-making under physical exhaustion and nutritional stress. Apache training explicitly addressed these psychological demands through practices that contemporary observers sometimes misunderstood as ceremonial or religious observance, and which were in fact sophisticated psychological conditioning programs. The practice of ritual silence, for example, extended periods during training when no speech was permitted, sometimes lasting days, served multiple functions simultaneously. It developed the capacity for sustained attention without the cognitive anchoring effect of verbal self-narration. It habituated the trainee to operating without verbal communication in circumstances where sound discipline was critical, and it forced the development of non-verbal attentiveness to environmental information that speech normally suppresses. A person accustomed to continuous verbal processing of experience perceives a narrower band of environmental information than one trained to operate in silence. The cognitive resources committed to verbal processing are not available for environmental monitoring. Apache scouts, trained from youth to periods of absolute silence, developed a perceptual breadth that served them directly in the field. Controlled exposure to fear was another element of psychological preparation that Apache training explicitly incorporated. Young men in training were deliberately exposed to frightening experiences. Isolated in darkness in country known to contain predators, required to approach and handle dangerous animals, sent on solitary night movements through territory that had genuine hazards, not to eliminate fear, but to develop a comfortable operational relationship with it. The goal was not fearlessness, which is physiologically impossible and tactically counterproductive. The goal was the ability to experience fear without the cognitive impairment that unprepared individuals suffer when genuinely frightened. The tunnel vision, the disruption of fine motor control, the degradation of decision-making quality that characterizes the fight-or-flight response in people who have not learned to function through it. An Apache scout in a dangerous situation was afraid in precisely the same physiological sense as any other human being. The difference was that his training had conditioned him to think clearly and act effectively while afraid, which is an extraordinarily difficult skill to develop and an extraordinarily valuable one in operational contexts. The specific demands of functioning as a scout for the U.S. Army during the Apache Wars added a layer of complexity to this psychological picture that is often underappreciated in popular accounts. Apache scouts employed by the Army, and at peak periods, the Army employed several hundred Apache scouts simultaneously across multiple units, were operating in a situation of profound moral and political ambiguity. They were tracking and helping to capture or kill members of their own cultural community, sometimes including close relatives, in service of a government that was simultaneously dispossessing that community of its land and attempting to confine it to reservations. The motivations that led individual Apache men to serve as scouts varied considerably. Some were driven by long-standing interband rivalries that predated American presence in the region, some by economic necessity, some by genuine tactical alliance with specific Army officers they respected, some by a strategic calculation that alignment with American military power represented the best available path through an impossible situation. The historical record does not permit simple characterization. What is consistent across the historical record is that Apache scouts employed by the Army were not simply applying their traditional skills in service of a new employer. They were navigating a complex social and political situation while doing so, and the quality of their performance under these conditions reflects a psychological resilience and adaptive capacity that deserves explicit recognition. The scouts who tracked Geronimo's band through the Sierra Madre in 1886 were doing something that had no precise precedent in their own cultural tradition. Following the trail of men who were, by the standards of Apache warrior society, extraordinarily capable and who would certainly kill them if they could. The combination of technical skill, physical capability, and psychological fortitude required for that work was remarkable by any measure. The specific geography of the final campaigns against Geronimo's band provides the most detailed historical record of Apache scout movement capability, and it repays close examination. The Sierra Madre Range, across which much of this action took place, is terrain of a severity that defies comfortable description. The mountains rise from desert floor in escarpments of several thousand feet, with canyon systems so deep and narrow that sunlight reaches the bottom for only a few hours daily. The vegetation at higher elevations transitions from desert scrub to dense pine and fir forest, creating a landscape that requires completely different movement techniques at different altitudes within a single operational day. Paths through this terrain are minimal, mostly game trails, and the generations-old routes of Apache movement that were known to the scouts but to almost no one else. The Army infantry and cavalry units that attempted to follow into this country without scout guidance invariably found themselves lost, waterless, and exhausted within days. General Crook's approach, which ultimately proved the most effective of the multiple strategies tried against the hostile Chiricahua, was essentially to acknowledge that the Army could not operationally outperform Apache scouts in this terrain, and to instead direct Apache scouts against Apache targets. The logic was militarily sound, even if the ethics of the situation were complex. Apache scouts tracking Apache fugitives in the Sierra Madre were matching capability against capability, local knowledge against local knowledge, and the margin of advantage held by the trackers over the tract was a matter of specific information, the specific location of Geronimo's specific camp on a specific day, rather than a general capability difference. Getting that specific information required getting Apache scouts into the Sierra Madre in sufficient numbers, keeping them supplied across terrain that had defeated every previous Army logistics effort, and maintaining their operational commitment through weeks of physically brutal movement in hostile country. The scout units that accomplished this in the spring of 1883 moved through the Sierra Madre at speeds that the Army officers accompanying them found astonishing. Captain Emmett Crawford, who commanded the scout battalion on one of these penetrations, recorded in his field reports a consistent daily movement rate that outpaced anything his cavalry had previously achieved in comparable terrain, accomplished on significantly reduced water and food rations, with a casualty rate from the environment itself that was dramatically lower than any previous Army operation in the same area. The difference was not equipment or numbers. It was the comprehensive environmental intelligence and physical capability the scouts brought to the operation. What year did you first learn about Apache scouts in school? Or did you? Let us know in the comments. We're curious how many of you are discovering this story for the first time right now. The role of astronomical and meteorological knowledge in Apache scout movement is a dimension of their capability that receives relatively little attention in popular accounts, but that was operationally significant. Desert navigation across terrain without obvious landmarks required the ability to use celestial references, the position of specific stars, the arc of the sun, the behavior of shadows at different times of day, as orientation tools, and Apache scouts had developed a detailed and practically oriented astronomical knowledge that served this navigation function. The ability to determine cardinal direction from star position at night, to estimate time from shadow angle during the day, to read weather patterns from cloud formation and wind shift, and to predict the availability of water sources from seasonal and meteorological conditions, represented a body of practical science that was not poetic or mystical, but empirical and precise. Meteorological reading was particularly valuable in a landscape where weather could shift with dangerous speed. Thunderstorms in the desert southwest can develop from apparently clear skies with minimal warning, and they bring specific hazards, flash flooding in canyon systems being the most immediate, that require anticipatory response rather than reactive response. An Apache scout who could read the early signs of developing weather, specific cloud types appearing at specific elevations, particular quality of light, characteristic wind shifts, could make tactical decisions about route selection and camp location that avoided these hazards while they were still distant. A scout who waited until the storm was visible had already missed the optimal decision window. This meteorological reading was not a formal academic discipline, but an empirically developed pattern recognition system built from lifetimes of observation in a specific landscape. The transmission of all of this knowledge from generation to generation was accomplished through a system of apprenticeship and experiential education that was far more sophisticated than the informal transmission it might superficially resemble. Young men learned from experienced practitioners through extended periods of direct observation and guided participation, progressing through clearly understood stages of competence with specific knowledge domains: water geography, tracking, camouflage, signaling, imparted in sequences that built from foundational principles to advanced application. The knowledge was not simply described but demonstrated, and the trainee was not considered to have learned it until he had demonstrated reliable performance of it in realistic conditions. This is, in structure, essentially identical to the apprenticeship model used in skilled trades and professions in virtually every human culture. The difference is in the specific content being transmitted and the conditions under which competence was assessed. The oral tradition that carried historical and geographical knowledge across generations also served a navigational function that is easy to underestimate. Apache oral literature was not purely narrative in the artistic or ceremonial sense. It embedded geographical and environmental information in forms that made it memorable and transmissible. Stories that described specific landscapes in ways that preserved their key features, songs that encoded route information, ceremonial practices associated with specific locations that ensured those locations remained in community memory across generations. A young person who had absorbed this oral tradition had, among other things, a detailed geographical knowledge of territories they had never personally visited, derived from the accounts of predecessors who had moved through those territories under operational conditions. This was supplementary to direct experience, but not trivial. It provided contextual knowledge that allowed direct experience to be interpreted and integrated more rapidly and accurately. The relationship between Apache scouts and the specific animals of the desert Southwest was a dimension of their environmental knowledge that had direct operational relevance in ways that are not immediately obvious. Certain bird species, ravens, particular hawk species, some corvids, are reliable indicators of human presence in ways that experienced observers could read at significant distances. The behavioral difference between a raven investigating a natural food source and a raven interested in a human camp or column is visible to anyone who knows what to look for, at distances of hundreds of meters under good visibility conditions. Apache scouts used this bird behavior as a real-time surveillance system, reading the activity patterns of birds across their operational area as continuously updated information about the presence and location of human activity. The same principle applied to other animals. The specific alarm calls of deer, the flight behavior of quail, the movement patterns of predators, all of which conveyed information about human presence and movement in the broader landscape. The snake and spider fauna of the desert Southwest presented specific hazards that Apache movement doctrine addressed directly. Rattlesnake encounter was a genuine operational risk in certain seasons and terrain types, and the behavioral and movement adaptations that minimize this risk. Specific patterns of foot placement, avoidance of particular terrain features at certain times of day, sensitivity to the specific sound and smell signatures that preceded encounter were integrated into standard movement practice. The management of scorpion risk in desert camps, the practice of checking footwear before donning, of sleeping on elevated surfaces where possible, of maintaining specific camp hygiene practices, similarly reflected accumulated operational experience with a genuinely dangerous environmental hazard that claimed lives with some regularity among populations less familiar with it. The question of what Apache scouts actually saw when they looked at a landscape, what categories of information their visual processing prioritized, is philosophically interesting and operationally relevant. There is substantial evidence from cognitive science that sustained training in specific forms of visual attention does, in fact, alter the organization of visual perception in ways that are not merely metaphorical. Expert trackers, ornithologists, radiologists, chess players, each of these groups demonstrates measurably different patterns of visual attention and information extraction when looking at their domain of expertise, compared to novices looking at the same visual field. Apache scouts, trained from youth in environmental observation across specific categories of information, almost certainly perceived the desert differently than their army counterparts in a literal, neurological sense, not seeing different things in a mystical way, but processing the same visual field through a cognitive architecture that had been shaped by years of specific attentional practice to prioritize specific types of information. The experienced tracker sees the footprint that the untrained eye walks past without notice, not because it is more visible to him, but because his visual system is organized to detect and flag exactly that category of stimulus, while suppressing less operationally relevant information. Pause for a second. If you've made it this far into the video, you're clearly someone who cares about real history. Tell us in the comments, what other chapter of Native American military history do you want us to cover next? Your suggestions actually shape what we make. The integration of spiritual practice into Apache Scout operations is a dimension that requires careful handling in a historical account because it is simultaneously genuinely important and easily misrepresented. Apache's spiritual practice was not separable from practical life in the way that religious observance is conceptually separable from secular professional activity in modern Western culture. The ceremonies, prayers, and ritual practices that accompanied preparation for a scouting mission were not merely psychological preparation in the modern therapeutic sense, though they did serve that function. They were understood by practitioners as direct engagement with the powers and entities of the natural world that the scout would be navigating, as a form of relationship management with the landscape itself. Whether one interprets this in theological or psychological terms, the practical effect was the cultivation of a specific attentional and motivational state that enhanced performance, a focused, respectful, present-moment orientation to the environment that was cognitively consistent with the kind of careful, comprehensive environmental reading that made effective scouting possible. Specific ceremonial practices were associated with specific types of operations. The preparation for a long scout through unfamiliar territory involved different ritual components than preparation for a night movement or a confrontation with a known adversary. These distinctions reflected an implicit categorization of operational types and their associated demands that was encoded in cultural and ceremonial practice. A scout who had gone through the appropriate preparatory ritual for his specific operational type was not simply comforted by familiar routine. He had explicitly reminded himself, through the structure of the ceremony, of the specific attentional demands, the specific hazards, and the specific resources available to him in that type of operation. This was mnemonic and motivational technology embedded in spiritual practice, and it worked. The legacy of Apache Scout service in the United States Army extends beyond the campaign period in ways that deserve recognition. Apache Scouts, who served through the campaign years, developed a depth of operational experience in desert warfare and reconnaissance that had no parallel elsewhere in the American military establishment, and their practical knowledge informed Army tactics in ways that persisted long after the specific campaigns ended. The principles of small unit reconnaissance movement that Apache Scouts demonstrated, the emphasis on environmental intelligence over brute force, the value of local knowledge and adaptive movement over standardized doctrine, the integration of tracking, signaling, and terrain reading into a unified operational practice, found their way into Army doctrinal thinking about light infantry and reconnaissance operations in forms that are recognizable in modern special operations practice. The formal designation of the Apache Scouts as a unit, they received official recognition as the White Mountain Apache Scouts, among other designations, and the retention of certain scout units long past the end of the active campaign period reflected an institutional acknowledgement of a capability that the regular army could not replicate through training alone. Scout units served through the 1880s and 1890s in various roles, and individual Apache Scouts with exceptional records were sometimes retained as instructors and consultants for longer periods. The knowledge they carried was recognized as irreplaceable, not something that could be codified in a manual and transmitted in a classroom, but an embodied intelligence that required years of specific environmental experience to develop. The broader historical context of Apache Scout service, the dispossession, the reservation system, the destruction of the traditional life that made their capabilities meaningful, is a story of loss as much as achievement. The Scouts who served with such remarkable effectiveness in the 1870s and 1880s were serving in a historical moment that was, in ways they likely understood clearly, the final chapter of a way of life. The specific intelligence they brought to their work, the water knowledge, the terrain reading, the tracking, the meteorological awareness, the botanical and zoological understanding, was inseparable from a landscape-based culture that the reservation system was actively dismantling. The children of the Scouts who tracked Geronimo through the Sierra Madre grew up in circumstances that did not permit the transmission of that knowledge in its full operational form. The specific environmental intelligence that represented generations of accumulated adaptation began to attenuate as the cultural and ecological contexts that had produced and sustained it were disrupted. This is not a story that resolves neatly. The Apache Scouts were remarkable human beings, operating at the absolute limits of human capability in one of the most demanding environments on the planet, and they did so with a consistency and effectiveness that left an indelible mark on the military history of the American Southwest. They were also men caught in a historical trap, serving a government whose policies were destroying their world, tracking relatives whose resistance to those policies was, by any moral calculus, entirely understandable. The history holds both of these things simultaneously, and honest engagement with it requires holding them simultaneously rather than resolving the tension into a simpler story. The desert they moved through is still there. The Sierra Madre still rises from the Sonoran floor in those same escarpments. The tinajas still fill after rain and hold water through dry months. The ravens still wheel above the canyon rims, reading the landscape below for opportunity. The tracks of whatever moves through that country are still there in the dust and sand, available to anyone who has learned to read them. What is gone, or rather, what has been severely attenuated, though not entirely lost, is the specific human intelligence that could move through that landscape at speed, reading all of it simultaneously, making decisions at the rate the environment demanded, sustained by knowledge built across generations of careful observation and practical trial. That intelligence was not supernatural. It was human capability, developed to an extraordinary degree by a culture that had adapted to one of the most demanding environments on Earth, and its loss represents a diminishment that we are still, in various ways, trying to reckon with. The Apache Scouts represent something important in the broader history of human environmental knowledge, a demonstration of what becomes possible when a human community directs its collective intelligence toward deep, sustained engagement with a specific landscape over a long period of time. The capabilities that resulted were not primitive survival skills in the dismissive sense that phrase sometimes carries. They were sophisticated, empirically derived, precisely calibrated responses to the specific demands of a specific environment, developed through the same basic cognitive processes: observation, hypothesis, testing, refinement, transmission, that produce sophisticated knowledge in any domain. The desert Southwest produced in the Apache Scouts some of the most effective practitioners of terrain-based intelligence in human history. Understanding how they achieved what they achieved is not merely a matter of historical curiosity. It is an encounter with a form of human excellence that deserves to be recognized on its own terms. You've stayed with us through the entire story, and that means everything to us. If this video opened your eyes to a part of American history that doesn't get nearly enough attention, share it with someone today. Drop a comment, tell a friend, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. There's a lot more history waiting for you right here.